Manipulating the results to bring Imran Khan's government into power.
The government says the opposition is simply rattled by investigations into their financial dealings. Spearheading the protests via video link from London is the former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. Some of his supporters here are brandishing toy lions, the symbol of his party.
एजेंसियों में political engineering की फैक्ट्रियां बंद करो.
Using unprecedentedly direct language, Sharif accuses a group of generals of ousting him from power on the pretext of corruption charges. The intelligence agencies must stop political engineering, he says. After being sentenced to 7 years in jail, Sharif was allowed to temporarily travel to London on medical grounds last year. Now, he shows no sign of returning.
He has been convicted by a court and now he is being asked by a superior court to return and serve his sentence.
The government, led by Imran Khan, says the protests are an attempt by Nawaz Sharif and his allies to evade justice. They're calling on Britain to deport him. Shehzad Akbar is advisor to the Prime Minister on accountability.
We're asking British government to deport Nawaz Sharif because from our side, Nawaz Sharif has not only violated the undertakings and the court orders that were given here, but he is also in violation of British immigration laws. He is a convict who has to serve and undergo remaining of his sentence, and he is required in many other cases of corruption and corrupt practices.
The rally in Lahore was the culmination of a series of demonstrations held across the country in recent weeks. But with coronavirus cases spiking and no social distancing in the packed crowds, the government has accused the opposition of endangering lives. I put that to Ehsan Iqbal, Secretary General of Nawaz Sharif's PMLN party.
We are in the middle of a pandemic. Many people would say it's irresponsible to hold rallies like this now, with clearly not much social distancing going on. How would you respond to that?
We have a dilemma. On one side, there is individual security. On the other side, we also feel compelled. The collective security of our state is in danger.
Opposition leaders are now threatening to march on the capital early next year. Pakistan's political tensions look set to rise further.
Sikandar Kamani reporting. That's it for NewsHour. I'll be back tomorrow. I hope you'll join me then. Bye-bye.
This is the BBC World Service, where the story of the anti-government protests in Belarus continues.
For over 100 days, Alexander Lukashenko has faced mass demonstrations against his 26-year rule. These are the stories of the protesters who no longer recognize him as their president.
Every time we go out to protest, we are really afraid.
Belarus across the barricades at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries. And in an hour, we join Ben James for OS.
We'll hear the conversation in South Korea after coronavirus cases rose to record levels. Still low in global terms, but we'll find out how Koreans feel about new restrictions to deal with it.
That's in an hour. On air, online and on mobile. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Coming up after the news, it's People Fixing the World with me, Amy Elizabeth. Today we're talking about meat, but not meat from the slaughterhouse, meat that's been produced without any animals being killed.
We start growing the meat from a small sample of cells that we take from an animal, and we grow the cells in a liquid which contains all the nutrients required to allow the cells to grow.
The benefits of lab-grown, or cultured meat, are potentially massive for the planet, and biotech startups are trying to perfect the technique.
Keeping these cells happy on a large scale is a challenge. You can basically imagine this like a brewery, but only then if you're not brewing beer, but you're using animal cells to create meat eventually.
Can meat grown in factories change the planet? That's all coming up on People Fixing the World after the BBC News.
Hello, I'm Debbie Russ with the BBC News. The World Health Organization has warned of a big shortfall in funding for its plans to ensure coronavirus vaccines, tests and treatments are available to all countries. A senior WHO official, Bruce Aylward, said this shortage was standing in the way of efforts to get the world out of the pandemic as quickly as possible. Wealthier nations have been focused on buying vaccine doses for their own people. The WHO wants all countries to pool resources to make sure everyone gets fair access to medical technology. Mr. Aylward said this was the only way to deal with the problem effectively.
If we don't do this in a coordinated way, it is going to cost more, be slower. This is just going to drag out longer. Right now, financing is what stands between us and getting out of this pandemic as rapidly as possible. It's as simple as that.
The WHO is now looking at new financing methods, including loans and bonds. The European Medicines Agency has brought forward the date when it will meet to consider approving a German-developed vaccine for use in the European Union. It will now meet on the 21st of December. Several other countries, including Britain, have already started mass vaccination programmes using the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. The German Health Minister Jens Spahn said he wanted approval urgently.
Our national authorities, like others, are supporting the European authorities as best they can. And the goal is to get approval before Christmas. We want to start vaccinating in Germany on New Year's Eve, actually before New Year's Eve, as soon as possible after approval.
Pakistan has brought in new anti-rape laws which aim to deliver faster convictions and tougher penalties, including the use of chemical castration. The anti-rape ordinance signed by the president on Tuesday provides for special fast-track courts to be set up across the country to hear rape cases. It also provides for some offenders to be chemically castrated and orders the setting up of a sex offenders register. Human rights activists say the Saudi authorities are holding hundreds of mostly Ethiopian migrant workers in appalling conditions and that they've been subjected to beatings. Our Middle East analyst Alan Johnston reports.
The campaign group Human Rights Watch has circulated videos showing migrant workers enduring hopelessly overcrowded and insanitary conditions at a detention centre in Riyadh. The group says the detainees have been subjected to beatings and that there have been reports of at least 3 deaths. The majority of those being held are Ethiopians, but there are also people from other parts of Africa and South Asia. Most were arrested because they didn't have residence permits and they're expected to be deported. The Saudis haven't yet responded to the allegations of ill treatment.
Alan Johnston reporting. This is the World News from the BBC. The Ukrainian parliament has voted to restore powers that were stripped from the National Anti-Corruption Agency by the Constitutional Court in October. President Volodymyr Zelensky had warned that relations with the European Union would be damaged unless the country pursued its drive against corruption. Here's Mike Sanders.
Volodymyr Zelensky has made the drive against corruption a cornerstone of his presidency. He threatened to sack the Constitutional Court judges after they diluted the anti-corruption agency's powers to delve into the finances of members of parliament. The new law will let the agency check the MPs' declarations of assets and probe possible conflicts of interest. The criminal offence of hiding sources of income, initially struck out by the court, had already been restored. President Zelensky hopes it will smooth the disbursement of a $5 billion loan the IMF approved in June to see the country through the coronavirus pandemic.
A Vietnamese activist has been jailed for 12 years after writing articles critical of the government and posting them on social media. Tran Duc That, a poet, was convicted of attempting to overthrow the communist government. Vietnam has stepped up its efforts to silence critics ahead of a Communist Party Congress in January. The President of Guinea, Alpha Condé, has been sworn in for a controversial third term following an election which was marred by violence and allegations of fraud. Mr Condé said a constitutional referendum in March allowed him to run again, despite a 2-term limit for presidents. Amnesty International said it was the culmination of a process involving serious human rights abuses. A court in Uganda has ordered the police to drop all charges against 2 Nigerian musicians who were arrested on Monday and accused of spreading the coronavirus by holding a show over the weekend. The court ordered Omar Lay and Thames be immediately released from prison. The arrests were widely condemned in Nigeria and prompted other musicians, including Burna Boy, to call for their release. That's the latest. BBC News.
People fixing the world.
The World from the BBC World Service, the programme that looks for solutions to some of the world's problems. I'm Amy Elizabeth, and for the last 20 years, I've been a vegetarian. It's not that I didn't like the taste of meat. In fact, I loved it. I love bacon sandwiches. I loved a Caesar salad. I just didn't feel completely comfortable with the idea of an animal being killed for my food, so I gave it up. Now, though, it seems the opportunity to get meat back into my diet is a real possibility, without any animals getting hurt in the process. Real meat, not fermented mushrooms or soy protein, but meat which has been grown in giant containers and not butchered from an animal. Today, I'm going to take you into the world of lab-grown meat to find out exactly what it is, how it might help the planet, and when it might become available.
So let's start with a discussion of nomenclature. You've used the term lab-grown meat. We tend to use the term cultivated meat. Folks may have also heard cultured meat or cell-based meat or clean meat.
Well, that told me. This is Dr. Liz Specht from the Good Food Institute, a non-profit organisation based in the US who are advocates for this cultivated meat.
There are a lot of different terms being used to describe the same basic technology, which is growing conventional, genuine animal meat, but growing it through animal cell culture.
To be honest, I can understand why some companies are avoiding the term lab meat. It doesn't sound very appealing, does it? Now, the reason I stopped eating meat was purely ethical, but there are many reasons why meat farmed the traditional way is problematic.
As your listeners may be aware, animal agriculture is one of the most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems. That's actually a direct quote from a United Nations Food and Agriculture report several years ago in terms of contributions to things like land and water and air pollution, in terms of runoff from animal waste. It's a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, of course, which are driving climate change. It's a huge contributor to things like deforestation and the resulting biodiversity loss. A lot of the forest land that we've seen being cleared in places like Brazil in recent years is directly for the purpose of increasing pasture land, or in some cases increasing farmland to grow feed crops for animals.
Okay, you can roll your eyes at me if you want, but I'm feeling a saintly vegetarian glow right now. But that's not the point. There are billions of people that don't want to give up meat. So, in terms of a solution, meat without animal farming is a pretty big win.
There have been a handful of life cycle assessments that various researchers have done to try to estimate what these environmental benefits of cultivated meat may be. And of the studies that are out there so far, they project about a 95% reduction in land use, so about 20 times more efficient than conventional meat production.
The carbon footprint is also lower. Potentially much, much lower. But it also takes a lot of energy to make this stuff, so it all depends if you can get the energy from renewable sources. And these aren't the only positives.
It's estimated that by the year 2050, antibiotic resistance bacteria may be responsible for more deaths globally each year than cancer. So we know this is a looming threat. We know that animal farming is one of the sort of greatest sources of antibiotic resistance. And so a move towards cultivated meat allows us, again, to grow these cells in a clean, sterile, closed, contained environment where things like chronic antibiotic use are not necessary whatsoever.
Okay, so if this lab-grown, cultured meat can be made to work, it would kill an awful lot of birds with one stone. Okay, maybe not the best phrase to use here, but it would help solve a lot of problems. So, how does it work? To find out, I was offered a virtual tour by Dr. Ruth Farron of Higher Stakes, a small startup making this meat in the UK. Ruth, thank you so much for inviting me down today. This is actually my first time in a lab since school, so it's definitely been a while. Is this exactly where you grow the meat?
It is, yeah. We start growing the meat from a small sample of cells that we take from an animal, so usually samples such as a skin tag, and we take the cells from there and grow them in huge numbers. From there we can basically turn the cells into the cells that make up meat, so mainly muscle and fat cells.
So explain the process. When you say extract the cells, do the animals need to be put to sleep first?
No, absolutely not. So if you think of the procedures that farmers traditionally do, so they'll take, for example, a small skin tag. So if they tag their animal, they take a punch through the skin, which is very, very small, like less than a millimetre sometimes. And from that very small sample, there are actually hundreds of cells in there that we can then use to grow the meat from.
So the animals aren't experiencing any pain at all?
Exactly. There's no pain at all.
Okay, so once you've got your skin tag or meat sample, what's next?
So once we've obtained the cells, we grow them in an incubator in little flasks that we call tissue culture flasks. Pigs have actually a body temperature of between 38 and 40 degrees. So that's the temperature we grow the pig cells at. And we grow the cells in a liquid which contains all the nutrients required to allow the cells to grow.
Can I ask what's in the liquid that it's getting fed? I'm assuming it's stuff for energy and nutrients.
Yeah, so basically it's all of that. So they have amino acids, they have sugars, salts, the pH is monitored. So the cells obviously would excrete toxins, so the pH is important to track.
Okay, so I'm looking at something on the screen that looks almost like an ultrasound.
So we look at them through a microscope. Once we have the cells grown to the number that we require, we then turn them into the muscle and fat by changing the liquid that we feed them with. And the cells grow, they're very rounded, so they grow in what we call colonies, so they grow really close to one another.
So are you cloning cells? Is that the right terminology? I'm not sure of the language around it.
No, we're not cloning cells, that's a completely different terminology. Traditional cloning is basically the process by producing individuals with the same DNA, which is technically artificial. But what we're doing is allowing the cells to naturally grow and proliferate. So it's a very natural process, and we're not creating the clones, they're doing it naturally themselves.
So how do you take it from a group of cells to something that potentially we could end up eating?
So we actually grow the cells in 3D, so on a scaffold or a biomaterial, which is able to support the cell growth. So depending on what the end product of the meat will be, depends on how much scaffolding or biomaterial we add. For instance, if we were to want to just make a pork sausage, the structure wouldn't be as important as in if we wanted to make some bacon.
Okay, so because steak has to be firm, it needs to be structured. But with something like sausage meat, that's quite forgiving because it's usually quite congealed.
Yeah, exactly that. So the cells won't differ between the two, so they'll still have the same muscle or fat cells there. But the difference is a sausage is made of mince, for instance, or a beef burger is made of mince, whereas a piece of bacon or a steak, they're structures. So yes, we would need more of a scaffolding in place.
So do you need to keep extracting fresh cells from animals, or could you simply just keep reusing the same ones?
So the cells that we extract from the pig can then be turned into many iPSCs, or the stem cells, which are our starter cells. Those starter cells grow and grow and grow and grow. They proliferate in huge numbers. At the point in which we turn them into the muscle and fat, their cell growth does decline slightly, so we can't keep making muscle cells from muscle cells. We do have to go back to what we call the starter cells.
The basic science of growing cells in a lab has been known for quite a while, and using it for meat isn't a brand new idea. This is the press event from back in 2013, where a chef is cooking the world's first lab-grown beef burger.
Literally cooking like any other burger I've experienced before.
To be honest, the burger does look a little bit on the dry side, but the real problem is how much it costs to make. $300,000. And it only got made because one of the founders of Google paid for it. In the years since, loads of startups across the globe have joined the race to grow meat in the lab at a reasonable price. And they're trying with all different kinds of animal cells. In 2017, Finless Foods showed off a few small samples of their bluefin tuna.
We are making history right now.
In 2018, San Francisco startup Just fed BBC reporter James Cook a chicken nugget, with cells grown from just a feather.
I'm going to dip it in the sauce, take a bite. It's really tasty. It tastes like chicken. It tastes like chicken.
It is chicken, yeah.
Although the taste is very similar, the physicality, the feel of it in your mouth is slightly different.
Right.
I'm glad James got a chance to try the meat, because although a few companies did invite me for a tasting, unfortunately COVID restrictions got in the way and I couldn't travel. I did ask if they could send a sample, but was told they wanted to be in control of how the meat was prepped. Or maybe they just didn't trust my cooking. Now, a recent estimate from the World Economic Forum suggested it now costs $25 for a kilogram of lab-grown meat, which is quite a sharp improvement from that first burger. One of the companies that's fairly advanced with scaling up their meat manufacturing operations is Memphis Meats in California. They're working on beef, duck, and chicken products. Earlier this year, the company raised $161 million from investors, including Bill Gates, Richard Branson, and huge food companies, including Tyson Foods and Cargill.
I'm Steve Myrick, and I'm the Vice President of Operations at Memphis Meats.
So it appears to me that the biggest obstacle that's stopping this meat entering the mainstream and being able to be produced on a much larger scale is cost. Are steps being taken to keep these costs down?
Absolutely. Bringing down costs and scaling production are twin challenges, and they're both considerable. Well, cell culture is reasonably well understood in other industries like medicine. It is not built for that sort of scale. And we're trying to plan for building out production infrastructure that can exist everywhere and be operated by anybody, not just the PhD scientists that we have on our team today. So there's work to be done on all of those fronts, but we've made quite a lot of progress in all those areas as well.
If this meat gets rolled out into the mainstream, what will the labs look like? I mean, I'm imagining huge factories where, I don't know, will they potentially grow the cells in one area and then prep the meat in another?
The story of our industry up to this point has been one of research and development. I think we're at a very exciting transitional moment right now because, at least in the case of Memphis Meats, we think that we have a production system that's ready to build out to that commercial scale. So right now we're building out a pilot production facility. It will be about 38,000 square feet. And when you walk into it, it will look like a food manufacturing facility. It won't look like a laboratory. So you should imagine seeing big gleaming steel tanks, much like you would in a brewery today.
So realistically, what's the time frame that we're looking at? Will we be seeing this meat available in supermarkets and served in restaurants fairly soon?
We certainly hope so. For initial small-scale launches, the timeline will depend on clearing a few essential regulatory hurdles in lockstep with our partners at the Food and Drug Administration and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Both of those agencies have moved very quickly so far on this topic, and we're very grateful for that. So once those questions are resolved, we expect to be able to bring products to consumers for the first time, likely in just a few restaurants or retailers, since we haven't built up a huge production capacity at this stage. But we certainly hope those initial moments can come in the year 2021.
2021 is really very soon. So are you thinking that it will be available in very niche restaurants, or is it something that potentially could be in our local burger bar?
We certainly want to bring our products to consumers at many different price points. We don't want to be only in high-end upscale restaurants. We really do want to show that this innovation has the potential to be a solution for everybody. So we certainly don't intend to be only in Michelin-starred restaurants. We might show up there from time to time. That's certainly possible. But we also want to be in places where everyday people can try our products for the first time. So that might include burger bars and food trucks as well.
Has this got the potential to eradicate traditional farming? Because there may be some people that are a little bit apprehensive of if this becomes on a global scale, it could potentially harm farming industries that have long been established.
We absolutely believe that in the future, cell-based meat will be part of the solutions for feeding the planet, along with traditional farming methods. We certainly intend to augment and not disrupt those methods. And the food system is just so incomprehensibly vast that even if our goal were to produce all the food we could, it would still really just be a drop in the bucket in terms of the global food supply. So we absolutely need to work alongside today's producers in order to bring enough food to feed the planet.
Now, it's important to note that some meat farmers don't like the idea. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association in the US, for example, don't use terms like cultivated meat or lab-grown meat. They just call it fake meat. So, one of the big battles ahead might be around regulations of the lab or factory-produced meat and what the companies are allowed to call it, particularly when it hits the shops. Another obstacle is simply getting the costs down. And although Steve was pretty optimistic, the general consensus is that it is going to take a while. Here's Liz again from the Good Food Institute.
How long will it be before we can actually see these products, in our supermarkets or more widely available? And that's a much harder question to answer simply because it's so dependent on, how much continued investment and research activity and scale up we see in this industry in the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay, so to get the price down, you need to get those big meat brewery type things built. And you need to win the long PR war to persuade people that this is something they want to eat. But there's definitely enough going on around the world to suggest there's some momentum building behind it. A lab meat research institute was launched in India, for example, and last year the first meat was created in space on the International Space Station.
Ella Farms has become the first to produce slaughter-free meat in space.
This is another benefit of factory meat. In theory, you could put that factory anywhere. A couple of companies I spoke to talked about putting them in places where the weather or land conditions are too extreme for traditional farming. Places like Siberia or even on Mars. And just this month, Singapore became the first country to approve sales of a lab-grown meat product. There's one final thing we need to talk about in this race to make lab-grown meat cheap enough, and that's to do with the liquid that you grow the meat cells in. Because, until recently, the most common way scientists got the cells to multiply quickly was to use something called fetal bovine serum, often known as FBS.
It's a terrible product where people are using blood from cow fetuses to use as a growth liquid, since it contains all the triggers and nutrients for cells to thrive in. But this is, of course, if you use this in this system, it would defeat the purpose, and therefore really everyone in the field is trying to get away from it.
This is Dan Louning, founder of Dutch meat company Meatable. And I've got to say, as a vegetarian, the thought of eating something that's grown in the blood of fetuses that's collected in slaughterhouses, well, that's not quite what I had in mind here. Now, not everybody uses FBS. For example, Higher Stakes don't. And Memphis Meats, they say that while they did, they don't anymore. The trouble is, this liquid is really good for growing cells in, and making a replacement that's cheap enough, well, that's the big challenge facing the industry. One approach is trying to replicate FBS with plant-based liquid, and companies are trying all kinds of ways, including fermenting, to do this. But Dan Louning's company has a bit of a different approach. They don't take muscle stem cells from a skin tag to make their meat.
What we're doing is we're taking cells from an umbilical cord from a calf. These cells are special since they are very pluripotent. So the calf is just being born naturally, and we take just a little bit of the umbilical cord that it resides after the calf is being born, and we use these cells as a base where we can then expand them.
These cells don't need FBS to multiply.
So we're feeding them all the nutrients, so it's water, it's sugars, it's amino acids, just the normal things that any other animal would eat, but now in a ready-to-eat way for these cells to consume. And since they're what they call pluripotent, so they're able to become a lot. That's maybe how you can best describe it. They can become any cell in your body, and they have a real tendency of first expanding a lot before they will become a functional cell in an organism. And so using this power of these pluripotent cells and feeding it all the nutrients that a normal animal wouldn't eat, the cells keep on dividing to a point where we say, well, now we have enough of these cells. Now they're becoming muscle and fat in a way that is just like meat in a normal animal. So it basically is just imitating a natural process that is already happening in an animal, but now just without needing the entire animal to do so.
Hey, so if you're using the umbilical cord, does that mean that you'll need to impregnate a lot of cows and keep churning out these sort of fresh calves?
Oh, no, not at all. So the reason why we're using these cells is that they have a massive potential for growth. So if you're smart about it, you can basically use these cells to keep on going forever.
To be clear, the process Dan's now describing is cutting-edge bioscience, and it's certainly going to be a challenge.
We're using this unique technology from the University of Cambridge and Stanford, and this actually allows us to grow without fetal bovine serum. But since we're then using this different cell type, we have to do a little bit more work to get this up to scale and get the product just right, that you won't be able to distinguish it from real meat.
So before I was vegetarian, I really loved bacon sandwiches. When do you think I'll be... I did. They're the rip.
Yeah,
you can't replicate it. When do you think, realistically, I'll be able to eat one of those again with absolutely no animal dying or being harmed in the process?
So this is definitely what we're all about, right? We really want to create a product where nobody has to make a consensus in their preferences. Either if you're vegetarian and you think animal husbandry is very bad for the environment, but also for people themselves, this is exactly the point where we want to make. And we'll definitely send you the invite for 2023 when we have the first products coming out, and then I think we'll invite you to the Netherlands, and we can have the bacon, tomato, and lettuce sandwich that I think you've been waiting for so long.
Thank you so much. I'll need some tomato ketchup as well, please, to get the full experience. Is that okay?
That is perfect. Lovely.
That's it for People Fixing the World this week. If you'd like to get in touch, please do. Drop us an email, peoplefixingtheworld@bbc.co.uk. Thanks for listening.
This is the BBC World Service, the host of an annual series of talks from the most prominent and influential thinkers from across the world.
We present the Reith Lectures, an annual series of broadcasts.
The factors involved are as much economic as social.
Looking at economic systems and choices.
What is the biggest problem facing the world economy today?
We live in a time of financial crisis.
There will be a fundamental shift of economic power.
Economies, financial markets, they've long been a focal point of the Reith Lectures. How do they work, and how have they come to shape our society as a whole?
We value things in markets. How should we look at the value of life?
Dr. Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and Bank of England, charts how these economic principles have seeped into the way in which we think.
How do we channel the market in service of society?
And how this impacts the way we live.
The Reith Lectures, Wednesday at 10 GMT.
World Business Report is next. We've got your daily guide to the world of work and money. The European Union is unveiling new rules it says will overhaul how the technology giants operate. They've been concerned for years about cyberbullying, hate speech and fake news. We'll assess the planned laws and ask how it might change the behaviour of Silicon Valley. And there's been a big rise in sales of sewing kits and sewing machines, and it seems men are behind the increase. World Business Report follows the latest.
BBC News with Debbie Russ. The World Health Organization has warned of a big shortfall in funding for its plans to ensure that coronavirus vaccines, tests and treatments are available to all countries. The agency wants a global pool of resources to make sure everyone gets fair access to medical technology. There's concern that wealthier nations have focused on buying vaccines for themselves. The European Medicines Agency has brought forward the date when it will consider whether to approve a German-developed vaccine for use in the European Union. The agency will now meet on the 21st of December to discuss the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. In a tweet welcoming the decision, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said every day counts. Pakistan has brought in new laws to combat rape, which aim to impose faster convictions and tougher penalties. The government came under pressure to act after protests about sexual violence. The campaign group Human Rights Watch says the Saudi authorities are holding hundreds of migrant workers in appalling conditions. Most are Ethiopians. The group says there are reports of at least 3 deaths at a facility in Riyadh. The Ukrainian parliament has voted to restore powers that were stripped from the National Anti-Corruption Agency by the Constitutional Court in October. The new law allows the agency to check declarations of assets made by MPs. A Vietnamese activist has been jailed for 12 years after writing articles critical of the authorities and posting them on social media. Tran Duc That, a poet, was convicted of attempting to overthrow the communist government. A Ugandan court has ordered police to drop all charges against 2 Nigerian musicians who were detained on Monday. They'd been accused of spreading the coronavirus by performing at a concert over the weekend. The arrest of Omar Lay and Thames was widely condemned in Nigeria. BBC News.
Hello, this is World Business Report from the BBC World Service. I'm Rob Young. Welcome to the show. The European Union is getting tough on the technology giants. There'll be a new duty of care to protect users. Big tech could potentially be broken up if they repeatedly flout the rules. We look at what's planned and speak to an industry insider.
I don't think they're going to be broken up. No, I don't think it's necessarily, but I do think there is a big need for a dialogue on how we navigate on these new online economies around the world.
Also this half hour, the challenge of transporting coronavirus vaccines at incredibly low temperatures, and why there's been a surge in demand for sewing kits and machines this year, partly thanks to men.
You just get such a sense of achievement having done it, and when you're focusing doing it, I get very mindful and I'm just focusing on that and the rest of the world blots out, and I just find it very, very therapeutic and very rewarding.
Well, we'd love to hear your views on the stories we're covering on the programme today. You can tweet me. I'm at RobYoungUK. Now, you don't have to go very far on the web before you come across online bullying, hate speech, fake news, counterfeit goods, and much worse. For years, there have also been allegations of tax avoidance and anti-competitive behaviour by the technology giants. Well, in the European Union, the laws that govern web firms go back to the early 2000s, when many of today's big tech companies didn't even exist. So the EU is planning a radical overhaul of its digital services rules that regulate the likes of Google, Facebook and Amazon. That could see the big tech firms fined billions of dollars a year if they break the new tougher laws. The UK, which left the European Union earlier this year, has announced similar rules today as well. Laura Kayali is a technology reporter for the website Politico in Brussels, the home of the European Commission. She's been looking at the 2 new laws which are being planned by the EU and told me they'll bring in big changes compared to the existing regime.
What is expected to have the most consequences on the way big tech companies operate is the Digital Markets Act, because it will regulate the way they interact with their business users. And the Commission is preparing a list of do's and don'ts of behavior that will be banned. So, for example, the bigger tech companies could be prevented from favoring their own services and own products compared to those of their rivals and business users. So this could be a significant change in the way they operate. The Digital Services Act will deal more with illegal content online and illegal products sold online. The objective is to make the internet safer, but it will not be revolution in the way that companies operate because they already act on illegal content, not enough, some argue, but it's not going to be a massive overhaul of how they do things. It will be more obligations and more transparency requirements, but not a revolution.
So what is the EU most concerned about then? Is it the competition concerns or is it the the online harms, as they're called, the material that you can find on the web that is a bit unpleasant?
Both are of concerns for them, but on the online harm, they have already done things in the past, such as regulation on terrorist content online that was adopted just last week. They already did a copyright reform to fight against copyright infringing content. They have things on hate speech. So the competition aspect is more new because time has shown that the antitrust cases that Margrethe Vestager has launched did not do much to change the market. So the competition side is definitely most closely watched and definitely will change how the markets operate.
Is the EU trying to make the internet safe or just safer? Because an awful lot of the stuff that the EU is unhappy about, people being able to find online, you can find offline as well.
The new catchphrase now is what is illegal offline should be illegal online. So, for example, on consumer protection, on products, if your product is faulty or dangerous, you can either take it back to the store, like you know where your products come from, for example. You can buy something online from a trader and then you go back on the platform and the trader has disappeared and there's no way to contact them. So when it comes to consumer protection, they do feel that offline you're more protected than you are online.
Now, the EU is threatening fines of up to 10% of tech companies' turnover in the European Union. For repeat offenders, it's saying it could break up those companies. Is it clear whether the EU will see through that threat, whether it will break up a Google or a Facebook or an Amazon?
Well, they call that the nuclear option, which means it's definitely a last resort option. But what we see is that even in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission also is considering encouraging or wants to break up Facebook in the way that they want them to divest Instagram and WhatsApp. So if the United States is doing it, it becomes less of a taboo in Europe.
The UK left the European Union earlier this year. It is also today publishing an online harms regime. Is it broadly mirroring what the European Union is doing, or are there some key differences?
Well, the European Digital Services Act is really focused on illegal content, whereas the UK Online Harm Bill is a bit wider because it also covers harmful yet legal content. So this would be the main difference between the two.
Laura Kayali in Brussels. Well, the big tech firms, which are mainly American, are also facing a tougher climate in the United States. But the US approach is currently nowhere near as tough as the European Union's planned Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, or DSA and DMA for short. I've been talking to Cecilia Bonefield-Dahl, the Director General of Digital Europe, which represents the technology industry in the EU. Its members include Amazon, Facebook and Google. Does she accept that some tech companies' behaviour does need reining in?
It's 20 years since the last big reform of the internet regulations, so this is a huge moment. And a lot happened since 20 years ago. We didn't have the platform economy and hardly any online sales or social media platforms. It's always very valuable for us to have a dialogue on how we want to manage the online economy.
Do you accept that some companies are behaving in such a way that not only lawmakers but society at large find unpleasant and new laws are needed to rein that behaviour in?
I think it's more about looking about the structure of the new trade and how we act online than necessarily, in my view, to be targeting a few. And right now, of course, we have some big scalable companies that are setting the agenda, but a lot of these things are already being looked at. If we look at, for example, the DSA, there is a lot around hate speech, on illegal content, on counterfeit goods. And this is something that the big company's been working with for ages and is trying to solve. So we welcome any kind of clarity. Of course, there is always a super fine line between freedom of speech. You might have governments, using this also to limit freedom of speech. If you are a minority with a certain view, all of a sudden you can become harmful content. So there are really a fine line that we also have to be careful not to overstep.
But you don't have to go very far online, do you, to find online bullying, hate speech, fake news, and tech companies have clearly not been doing a good enough job of trying to take this stuff down from the web, have they?
A lot is actually done. I mean, then you can say good enough or not good enough. Many of them are really working on getting these type of contents down, and also to prevent, for example, fake goods to be sold. But it's good to have a common framework for these. We totally agree on that. And actually, we have been working with the Commission on the DSA for quite a while. We don't really want industry to define what is illegal and harmful. I don't think this is upon the private sector putting censorship on specific things. I think it needs to be a collaboration between private and public sector.
So it appears as if, under the EU proposals, tech companies will be responsible for the content that they host, the content that is put up by us, the user. Do you think that is fair enough?
Depends on how, and the devil is in the detail, right? For example, we know that 44% of users say, okay, if we are buying online, we would prefer to actually have an identified business that we're trading with. And this is, of course, a good thing to actually be able to identify. Then if you flip it to the freedom of speech argument, if you don't have the right to be anonymous, then okay, if you are a gay activist in a country that doesn't appreciate of that, well, okay, all of a sudden you can be found and you can't express yourself. So there is a lot of work to be done, and we enter this with a totally open mind.
Well, given that you do represent companies of all different sizes across Europe, when it comes to the business side of things, the European Union says that tech companies have been turning users' data, our data, into money by developing new services or making it difficult for new, smaller companies to compete with them. And that is anti-competitive, isn't it?
It depends a little bit on the situation and how it's used. But it is definitely one area that we need to look into when this is not appropriate and when it is appropriate.
Now, the EU is threatening that if there are repeated violations of the new laws, and we don't yet know when they will come into force, they're saying that they will break up companies. Now, it did happen to big oil over a century ago, and the big tech firms, which are mainly American, control access to a vast amount of our information today. Do you think it is likely that Facebook, certainly, perhaps Google and Amazon as well, will be broken up at some point in the not too distant future?
Honestly, I doubt it. I think this is more about defining the future climate that we want to have together. And, you know, it's not only American companies. You also have Chinese companies. You also have some up-and-coming European companies. And remember, Europe has extremely strong rules of competition already. So I think first we need to see, do we need more tools, or are we just inventing new tools for the sake of it? If we need more tools, okay, how do we get these in a proportionate manner?
Digital Europe, Cecilia Bonefield-Dahl there, who's in the Danish capital, Copenhagen. More and more nations are giving regulatory approval to a coronavirus vaccine. One has already been approved in the UK, Bahrain, Canada, Saudi Arabia, the United States. And while wealthier nations have been buying stocks for their own citizens, the World Health Organization is warning that a big shortfall in funding could scupper plans to make sure everybody gets fair access to the jabs. Well, the BBC's Imogen Foulkes joins us from Geneva. Hi, Imogen. How big is this financial shortfall then?
Well, what the WHO told us this morning was that it was a staggering $28 billion, which sounds like a huge amount, but let's try and put it in perspective. This is a fund not just for vaccines, but also for diagnostics and for treatments, so that countries can pool their resources all together and bet on maybe quite a lot of possible vaccines, possible new treatments. Some of them will inevitably prove successful, and then everybody gets a share of them. And this is the way the WHO has been trying to persuade countries to invest, by saying, you know, you're really betting on a number of winners with us, whereas if you go it alone, you maybe have the funds to bet on one or two. You could be lucky if those countries who bought the Pfizer vaccine in advance, or you could have identified something else. There are a couple that haven't worked that countries have invested money in. Unfortunately, as we get vaccine approval, the wealthier countries are really, as you said in your introduction, they are racing to buy up doses for themselves.
And did the WHO point its finger at some nations in particular and say these countries are being quite stingy?
No, I think that's not going to do the WHO any favours. It hates, and like all UN agencies, it doesn't like to point the finger, particularly when its finger might be directed towards a potential donor. Part of today's information was pegged around the fact that Canada has come up with 485 million towards this collaborative fund. But what the WHO basically is stressing again and again, let's do this together, because unless we are all safe from this virus, unless it's gone everywhere, none of us will be safe. There are other things as well. There are new treatments coming online, but rather expensive treatments. And the WHO really wants support to purchase those for poorer countries, and it wants the pharmaceutical companies to make these new treatments and successful vaccines available at low cost or not-for-profit cost for poorer countries. They've had a semi-commitment from Pfizer, and they're waiting for the other big pharma companies to come on board. Again, they keep saying, look, this is a good investment. Doesn't sound like it right now, but it's a good investment in the long term.
Imogen Folks in Geneva, thank you. Well, cash isn't the only problem standing in the way of getting vaccines to people. It's likely to be a huge logistical challenge as well. In the case of the vaccines produced by Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna's, the challenge is not only how to distribute it, but also how to keep it cold in the process. The Pfizer-BioNTech jab needs to be stored at below minus 70 degrees Celsius. And that's where a product you may have seen in a theatre or at a nightclub comes in. The BBC's Theo Leggett has this report.
You take your lovely drink, whether it's a margarita or whatever cocktail that you like, and you insert a pellet of dry ice into the base of the chili stick.
Dry ice has plenty of uses, including making cocktails look very fancy, as Nikki Weatherup of UK firm Chili Stick is showing me.
And then, literally, you just pour your lovely drink. The fog that you see is actually the dry ice coming out as a gas. It's perfectly safe.
Chili Stick is a supplier of dry ice, and it's designed a tool that lets this remarkably cold substance be used to make drinks that bubble and smoke. But dry ice also has less frivolous uses, particularly in the pharmaceuticals industry, and demand may be about to rise sharply.
The UK becomes the first country in the world to approve a coronavirus vaccine. The Pfizer-BioNTech jab will be made available from next week.
We are going to begin with breaking news because tonight the FDA has authorized emergency use of Pfizer's coronavirus vaccine, an historic and hopeful.
The new COVID vaccine developed by Pfizer and BioNTech is effective, but it has a major drawback. It needs to be kept very, very cold, even when it's being transported. Dry ice is well suited to the task. It has a temperature of minus 78 degrees Celsius and changes directly from a solid to a gas without leaving any liquid behind.
Okay, so this is called a dry ice pelletizer, and essentially it takes liquid CO2, which is at a high pressure and a low temperature.
Chili Stick is hoping it can help out if there's a spike in demand. It has all the equipment needed to make dry ice, which is produced from liquid carbon dioxide, as the company's founder, Mike Ash, showed me.
Doses it into a cylinder and flashes it to atmospheric pressure, where the liquid changes to a solid, which we call dry ice snow, and a gas, carbon dioxide gas, all at minus 80 degrees centigrade.
And I can see it's very cold because the end of the pipe is covered in hoarfrost.
That's exactly right, yes. The temperature of the dry ice is minus 80, and the whole tube, the whole machine chills down, and so it condenses out moisture from the air and builds up a layer of frost in the cold parts.
But machines like this one, which churns out huge quantities of chattering ice in a cloud of impenetrable vapour, rely on a steady supply of carbon dioxide, as Mike's business partner Chris Buchanan explains.
Most CO2 in the UK is manufactured as a byproduct of fertiliser production using natural gas, and although much of that goes to waste, the amount that the CO2 industry requires is captured and liquefied and shipped around the country for use.
Now obviously if these vaccines need chilling to a great extent, and we're talking about millions of doses, is the industry geared up to fulfil that demand?
Well, it's very difficult to increase the overall capacity of CO2 that's available in the market because the machinery is a very long time, very expensive to create. However, the dry ice aspect of the CO2 industry is a very small element of the consumption. You can imagine that beers, soft drinks and so on consume a lot more CO2 than dry ice. And so you always have the prospect of saying, OK, let's reduce the amount that goes to those sort of industries in favour of dry ice. That's an absolute priority.
We could have to cut down on beer and soft drinks.
Well, there was, not last summer, the summer before, there was overall CO2 shortage across Europe, which was affecting things like the World Cup. And that was a consequence of the nature of CO2 production. And if that happened again, clearly we'd be in exactly the same situation.
Pfizer's vaccine is one of many developed to combat COVID-19, but early regulatory approval means it's likely to be widely used. So keeping large stocks of it cold will be vital, and frozen carbon dioxide suddenly looks like a valuable commodity.
The BBC's Theo Leggett reporting there. Let's have a look at what's been moving financial markets today with Susanna Streeter from the brokers Hargreaves Lansdown. Hi, Susanna.
Hello there, Rob.
We were talking earlier on about the crackdown on the technology giants from the European Union. What's happened to the share price of the big tech firms?
Well, we haven't got the detail yet, have we? But the expectations that the EU might threaten fresh fines or even break up big tech companies doesn't have them quaking in their boots just yet. Facebook's share price is down by just under 1%, continuing its gradual fall since the start of December, but still significantly higher than it was at the start of the year. Twitter's share price has actually gone up a notch. It's probably because any new rules are unlikely to come into force immediately and could be a year or so off, but it does add another bit of menace to the spectre rising over big tech of regulation. Already Chinese regulators have been flexing their muscles, halting the big IPO, the Ant Group, in its tracks. And in the US, Facebook faces legal action accusing it of stifling competition. We still don't know whether or not Democratic lawmakers could bring in extra rules when Joe Biden comes into power in the United States. Legislation will, of course, take time to be enacted, but the winds of change are blowing in the direction of much tougher regulation.
All right, now there is yet more evidence that we've been buying fewer clothes this year. The Spanish company that owns the chain Zara, Inditex, has said that sales fell 14% in the 3 months to October. That's perhaps not a surprise when people have got fewer occasions on which to have to wear new clothes, I suppose. But does Inditex expect things to get better anytime soon?
Well, yeah, I mean, it does also reflect, obviously, the impact of the secondary lockdowns that we've had rippling across Europe. There's no denying lockdowns are bad news for bricks and mortar retailers. And as you say, it's hardly the time to go out and buy a new outfit for a Christmas party, is it? However, the Zara owner is outshining lots of its rivals with its impressive online growth. And it's also got a really slick operating model, which includes integrating stock between physical stores and online, which has helped the group avoid amassing piles of unwanted goods. Of course, social distancing does act as a real tether to performance. Trading can only go so far if floor space is reduced. So although it's turning itself around for greater growth in the future, just don't expect a turnaround in its fortunes just yet.
OK, thank you, Susanna. Susanna Streeter there from Hargreaves Lansdown. In London, the 100 share index is currently down 1/3 of a percentage point at 65.08. On Wall Street, the Dow is up 1/4 of a percentage point at 29,938. You're with World Business Report on the BBC World Service. We are the world's radio station. Hello to our listeners in the Middle East and West Asia, tuned in on shortwave 7.485 megahertz from our Singapore relay station. And a special good evening if you're listening in Riga in Latvia on 100.5 FM. The pandemic has changed the way we buy things this year, and indeed what we have been buying. A British department store chain has reported a surge in sales of sewing kits this year. It seems there's been a rise in purchases of sewing machines as well. The trend is partly being driven by an increase in men who've decided to take up sewing and other forms of crafting in 2020. John Cole Morgan is a quilt maker in southern England. He also runs online tutorials for people keen to learn how to do it. I asked him how he got into making quilts.
I started doing all forms of crafting about 10 years ago, knitting, crochet, wanting to find something to be creative with. Being an accountant, I wanted a sort of creative outlook and outlet to be able to just enjoy myself more. And quilting I stumbled across about 7 years ago, and that has now become a career, which was very unexpected.
There's been an increase in sales of sewing kits and of sewing machines this year. Why do you think that is?
I think everybody being at home, they're reassessing their lives, and I think everybody is taking stock about what they're doing and what brings them joy and trying new things, and most people on furlough and things have had a bit more time, so if they ever did want to explore a craft of some kind, I think that's definitely been an avenue they've explored.
How does it bring joy into somebody's life?
It's very odd, especially in the quilting world. There's great hilarity on it when people ask you the question, you quilt. So you take a piece of fabric, you cut it up, and you sew the same piece of fabric to other pieces of cut-up pieces of fabric. How does that bring you joy? And it's basically like a cloth jigsaw puzzle, and you just get such a sense of achievement having done it. And when you're focusing doing it, I get very mindful, and I'm just focusing on that, and the rest of the world blots out. And I just find it very, very therapeutic and very rewarding. I think a lot of other people probably have as well.
Now, one of the factors that seems to be behind the big increase in sales of sewing kits and machines this year is that more men are getting into it. What do you think the attraction is? Because all of these things have traditionally been associated mainly with women.
Most definitely, and as you say, there aren't that many, certainly in the quilting world, not that many men in the industry. And I think now a lot more people are, because it brings such joy and happiness for them, they're not really worrying about that imagined stigma on it, because women are very, very welcoming in the crafting world, and they want more people to do it.
Do you think it is mainly a hobby, or are people making more of their own clothes as well?
I think the clothing making thing definitely is, it's that unique aspect, something that's totally for you. It's not, nobody else has got it, it isn't mass made, it isn't mass produced, so you've got something totally unique, which I think a lot of people really like and enjoy. And I think that's definitely something, because it's unique and it's handmade, it doesn't matter who makes it, everybody will make it differently. So I think that unique aspect is definitely a selling point for people.
And I suppose there is also the backlash against fast fashion at the moment, isn't there? There's, a lot of people are keen to have clothes that they can wear for a very long time, which might be taking some in if they've lost weight or whatever else, and that allows people to make their wardrobe more sustainable.
Most certainly, and for me, I'm definitely letting all my trousers out, where I think a lot of people will be doing the same. But the good thing with the clothing aspect is that clothing is usually made, the fast fashions not so much, but the older clothing which has got really good quality cottons. In the quilting world, I'm seeing a lot of people taking those and making those into quilts, and memory quilts for people who may have passed away and things. So it's taking that clothing that they loved and wore so much, then being able to make something more from it and recycling it and reusing it. That's definitely a philosophy that's growing, which I think is brilliant.
Do you think the increase in people who've taken up crafting and sewing in particular this year, do you expect it mainly to be a pandemic phenomenon? So once vaccines are widespread and life goes back to something like normality, people will give it up?
I hope not, and I'm hoping people wouldn't, because you do get such mindfulness from it, and you do get such relaxing qualities, and you feel so much better having done something out of crochet or needlework or any aspect like that. So I'm hoping people will carry on.
Quilt maker John Cole Morgan there. Well, if you've taken up a new craft or hobby this year, let us know what you've started doing and how it's changed your life. You can tweet to me. I'm at RobYoungUK. That is it for this edition of World Business Report. Remember, our 2 daily podcasts are always available from the BBC website and wherever you usually get your downloads. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, exploring a new era of board games.
Some rely on our desire to be the ultimate winner. Others are about player collaboration.
If you don't coordinate carefully and communicate well, things can get far out of hand pretty quickly.
And can board games influence our actions in the real world?
You can build empathy and understanding about other people's perspectives.
Board games, the politics of play. Saturday at 5:30 GMT. And at bbcworldservice.com, Sporting Witness.
We're going back to 1970. During a Springboks tour of the British Isles, anti-apartheid campaigners caused so much disruption that teams from South Africa were later banned from the UK until the end of white minority rule.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello, welcome
families over the festive break. There will be, though, a nationwide curfew in place from 8 o'clock in the evening. That will be lifted on Christmas Eve, but not on New Year's Eve. And then Italy is currently seeing the highest number of deaths since the end of March. And Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte has told Italians to expect a more sober Christmas without gatherings, hugs and kisses. And just one final word of optimism in all of this. The European Medicines Agency has just brought forward their meeting to discuss whether to authorise the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine from the 29th to the 21st of December. So good tidings they may bring.
Anna Holligan joining us live from the Netherlands. Thanks. Now, thousands of supporters of a new coalition of Pakistan's opposition parties have been attending large rallies across the country in recent weeks, demanding the government resign and accusing the military of engineering the previous elections. The Prime Minister, Imran Khan, has dismissed the protests as attempts by his rivals to pressure him into dropping ongoing corruption cases against them. Meanwhile, his government has called on Great Britain to deport the former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, who's been helping lead the movement from London, but has been declared a wanted man by courts in Pakistan. Sikandar Kamani reports from Lahore.
Dancing enthusiastically to popular songs, given political twists, thousands turned out for a major rally by Pakistan's new opposition alliance in Lahore on Sunday. The large crowd, in spite of the coronavirus pandemic, underlining how divided the country is, even if calls for the government to resign look unlikely to succeed.
Many of the people here are angry about the poor state of the economy, about rising food prices. But fundamentally, this is fallout from the elections 2 years ago. The opposition politicians addressing this crowd accuse Pakistan's powerful military of manipulating the results to bring Imran Khan's government into power.
The government says the opposition is simply rattled by investigations into their financial dealings. Spearheading the protests via video link from London is the former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. Some of his supporters here are brandishing toy lions, the symbol of his party. Using unprecedentedly direct language, Sharif accuses a group of generals of ousting him from power on the pretext of corruption charges. The intelligence agencies must stop political engineering, he says. After being sentenced to 7 years in jail, Sharif was allowed to temporarily travel to London on medical grounds last year. Now, he shows no sign of returning.
He has been convicted by a court and now he is being asked by a superior court to return and serve his sentence.
The government, led by Imran Khan, says the protests are an attempt by Nawaz Sharif and his allies to evade justice. They're calling on Britain to deport him. Shehzad Akbar is advisor to the Prime Minister on accountability.
We're asking British government to deport Nawaz Sharif because from our side, Nawaz Sharif has not only violated the undertakings and the court orders that were given here, but he is also in violation of British immigration laws. He is a convict who has to serve and undergo remaining of his sentence, and he is required in many other cases of corruption and corrupt practices.
The rally in Lahore was the culmination of a series of demonstrations held across the country in recent weeks. But with coronavirus cases spiking and no social distancing in the packed crowds, the government has accused the opposition of endangering lives. I put that to Ehsan Iqbal, Secretary General of Nawaz Sharif's PMLN party.
We are in the middle of a pandemic. Many people would say it's irresponsible to hold rallies like this now with clearly not much social distancing going on. How would you respond to that?
We have a dilemma. On one side, there is individual security. On the other side, we also feel compelled. The collective security of our state is in danger.
Opposition leaders are now threatening to march on the capital early next year. Pakistan's political tensions look set to rise further.
Sikandar Kamani reporting. That's it for NewsHour. I'll be back tomorrow. I hope you'll join me then. Bye-bye.
This is the BBC World Service, where the story of the anti-government protests in Belarus continues.
For over 100 days, Alexander Lukashenko has faced mass demonstrations against his 26-year rule. These are the stories of the protesters who no longer recognize him as their president.
Every time we go out to protest, we are really afraid.
Belarus across the barricades at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries. And in an hour, we join Ben James for OS.
We'll hear the conversation in South Korea after coronavirus cases rose to record levels. Still low in global terms, but we'll find out how Koreans feel about new restrictions to deal with it.
That's in an hour. On air, online and on mobile. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Coming up after the news, it's
stop further attacks from happening, and to also bring back all the students safely so that they can restore confidence to the Nigerian citizens that they are able to secure the lives and properties of Nigerians. We need help. The government should do their best to end insecurity in northern part of Nigeria.
Thanks very much indeed to Mohammed. And it's interesting, isn't it, Mayeni, hearing that he doubted whether just bandits, in inverted commas, could be responsible for carrying something like this out. If it is a militant group like Boko Haram that's done it, then they've, of course, done something like this before and maybe have more of the organisation and the infrastructure to be able to do it. So what is the government doing to address the concerns Mohammed expresses there, to give people a bit more reassurance their kids are safe?
So on Sunday, the military descended on Kankara, the head of the military visited and said that they had found a location where the gunmen were hidden and would flush them out. Very little seems to have happened on that front since then. We haven't had another announcement. Last night, before Abubakar Shekau's statement, before we started getting reports of it, the governor of Katsina State said on Twitter that they were negotiating with the gunmen and that the boys would be released soon. Now that Boko Haram has claimed responsibility, it's not clear if the government is negotiating with them. They certainly haven't commented since then. So we're waiting to see if the government is going to confirm who they're negotiating with, but many Nigerians are worried that negotiating with terrorists sets a dangerous precedent and are hoping that that's not what's happening.
Mayeni, thanks very much indeed. That's the BBC's Nigeria correspondent Mayeni Jones live with us from Kano, and thanks to Hassan and Mohammed for contributing to that as well. You're listening to OS on the BBC World Service with Ben James. Let me take you through some more stories from the Africa pages of BBC News Online. Nigerian musicians Omah Lay and Tems have been released from detention in Uganda after charges against them for allegedly breaching COVID regulations were dropped. The charges came from a concert they held in Uganda's capital Kampala on Saturday. Kenya has announced that it will open a consulate in the breakaway state of Somaliland by the end of March. Somaliland seceded from Somalia in 1991, but its attempts so far to gain international recognition as an independent country have been unsuccessful. And Tunisia's Prime Minister Hichem Mechechi says his country is not interested in normalising relations with Israel. This comes after fellow North African country Morocco became the fourth member of the Arab League to announce diplomatic ties with Israel in the past few months. Right, let's carry on talking about and explaining the latest on Brexit, Britain's exit from the European Union. Talks continue between the UK and EU to work out what their future relationship will be. An initial deadline passed on Sunday. The two sides said there'd been enough progress for the negotiations to continue. The ultimate deadline, the 31st of December, when the UK will stop following EU trading rules. The talks are trying to work out what those rules will be replaced with. Now, we're connecting to European journalists we've spoken to in the past all this week on OS to hear the conversations happening in some of those countries. So let's speak to Marie Billon, who's the UK correspondent for French radio station RTL, based here in London. Marie, thanks so much for your time. Great to have you back on OS.
Hi, Ben.
So what are the things you're telling your listeners at the moment about where these talks are?
Well, we're telling them that basically deadline is something that has a loose definition at the moment, of course, and that there's still a few big sticking point, but that reportedly most of the deal is done, and that the sticking points are the same for the UK as for France in particular, but for the EU in general. Of course, fishing is one of the main sticking points, and some countries in the EU care a bit less about fishing than we do in France. So that's something that we follow quite a lot, especially the regions in the north of France. So we're very tuned to what's happening basically here. But what we have to understand, that we perhaps don't have the sense of in the UK, is that in France, it's not as if our government was negotiating. Of course, it's the UK and the EU. And the EU are the 27 members represented by Michel Barnier. They basically given the power to Michel Barnier to negotiate in their name. So France is not in itself involved in the talks, which is very different in terms of how we follow it compared to in the UK.
And yet, I think it's fair to say that Emmanuel Macron has given the impression of being, to an extent, hardline and not shifting his stance when it comes to this, and that many of the people in France would say with good reason, because he shouldn't shift. Is that the characterisation he's trying to put across, or is that maybe just the interpretation being given to it by perhaps some in the UK media?
It's a bit of both, because basically, of course, having France playing the bad cop is something that the UK love to talk about. But it's true that France wants to basically be tough on Brexit, because there's the threat of Frexit as well. Of course, there's the presidential elections coming up in a few months' time, in less than 2 years, and there's a lot of social unrest in France as well. So basically, Emmanuel Macron wants to be seen as being tough, at least on the international scene, if he can't afford to be so tough at home. So it's a bit true, but in a way, I mean, what France has done is just not budge, because they given a mandate to Michel Barnier to negotiate along certain lines that they agreed with, along with the other 26 other members. And what France is doing is just saying that we are staying firm. They're not changing their lines of negotiation or their mandate. They don't want to change the mandate they've given to Michel Barnier. They're just staying firm, basically. And that's, of course, a bit of an issue, because with negotiation, there's always a leeway, but some countries would like the leeway to be a bit looser than it is at the moment. Whereas in France, they say that we've decided for something at the start, we are not going to budge now.
We'll be talking fish a bit later on, once again, in the programme. What would it mean, especially for French fishermen and women, for there not to be a deal, considering that French fishing vessels catch a fair amount of fish in what are currently UK waters?
Yeah, they catch 30% of their catch in the UK waters, and for some species of fish, it's 90% of their catch being caught in the in UK waters. So that's enormous. Basically, that would mean a loss of income enormous for the French fishermen. And even if the EU softens the blow with redistributing the quotas within the remaining members, it's still going to be basically a real loss for French fishermen, because not only would they not be able to go into UK waters, but it also mean that Danish fishermen, other fishermen that would fish as well in UK waters, would end up fishing perhaps in French waters. So it is an enormous ask for the fishermen. So in a way, they don't want Emmanuel Macron to be too soft on fishing, because they want him to basically protect them and protect their livelihood. But in a way, they say they have to be perhaps more pliable to reality, and find not at all costs, but almost at all cost, a way to basically have some kind of deal, because no deal is just the end for
so
most
many
of them.
aspects to this as well, aren't there? And we'll of course as well talk about the British fishing vessels that catch their fish in waters belonging to other European countries, and that'll be an aspect of another conversation on this on OS. Thank you very much indeed to Marie Billon, picking her way through those complex issues as correspondent here in the UK for French radio station RTL. Let's park the fish for a moment and welcome back Dr. Isaac Bogosh, an infectious diseases physician and scientist from the University of Toronto, here to answer your questions on the latest coronavirus developments. Good to have you back, Dr. Isaac. And we will start with talking about the Moderna vaccine, because we've heard in the past couple of hours from the United States that the Moderna vaccine safe, 94% effective, according to regulators from the Food and Drug Administration. How important will it be, Doctor, to have a second vaccine in the armoury then? And you know what? I think the pause was not because we didn't hear Dr. Isaac saying hello to me. It was because that his line had disappeared. But that is the breaking story in the last few hours that I wanted to talk to him about. Remember, the Moderna vaccine was another of the ones that reported extremely promising results early on in the last month or so. But it's the Pfizer one that got authorisation first of all. This looks like it may well be the second one to get authorisation in the United States because of those positive noises from the FDA. We will speak to Dr. Isaac in a moment, but I want to also bring you a story from the Netherlands on coronavirus, where a lockdown begins today, a pretty strict one for 5 weeks until the 19th of January. Non-essential shops, cinemas, hairdressers, gyms have closed. Schools are going to follow tomorrow as well. Restrictions will be slightly eased for the 3 days around Christmas, where households will be allowed 3 instead of 2 guests. Protesters have been gathering outside the Prime Minister's office, though, as he made the announcement, saying the country needed to bite this sour apple before things get better. Have a listen to this message we got from the Netherlands.
All non-essential shops will be closed from today. That's everything from garden centres to DIY stores. Supermarkets and grocers will stay open, though. Theatres, museums, cinemas, amusement parks, they will all be closed. Restaurants, takeaways only. That applies to cafes and cannabis cafes as well. Beauticians and hairdressers and sex workers, they are all banned from seeing clients now as well. And these rules are in place until the 19th of January. Across the border in Germany, situation is looking very similar. Their infection rates have been soaring as well. All non-essential shops will be closed from Wednesday. Schools will be closed too. The famous Christmas markets, most of them had already been cancelled. In France, some of the travel restrictions are actually being eased, so people will be allowed to visit their relatives over Christmas. On Christmas Eve, the curfew will be lifted, but it will be back in place on New Year's Eve. Italy is now experiencing among the highest number of deaths since the end of March. So Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte has warned Italians that it will be a sober Christmas. He said to avoid hugs and kisses, but he did have one reassuring note for the children that Father Christmas would be visiting because he was exempt from the global travel restrictions.
So one bit of good news there for the children of the Netherlands. That's the BBC's Anna Holligan explaining what's happening there. We've got Dr. Isaac Bogosh with us from the University of Toronto, I'm very glad to say. And Dr. Isaac, welcome. I was wanting to ask you about the Moderna vaccine. The FDA in the US saying it's safe, 94% effective. That means it could become the second one allowed in the US. How important will it be to have a second one in the armoury?
Oh my God, it'll be so important. It's certainly a lot easier to use, I think, compared to the Pfizer one. The storage requirements are much easier. You only need a -20 freezer instead of one of these -80 freezers. I think it seems to be a little bit more portable and more mobile. And actually, when you look under the hood and look at how this performs, it actually performs in a very similar manner to the Pfizer vaccine. They released a really inspiring graph that shows that you have a pretty significant degree of protection about 10 days after the first of 2 doses, and that was also seen in the Pfizer vaccine. So you might see earlier benefits well before your second dose. So great news on all fronts.
That is interesting and lovely to hear about an inspiring graph when we've heard about and seen so many pretty dismal, uninspiring ones over the past month. So that's good news. I want to play you this question as well, which is also connected to vaccines and the story most recently being talked about here in the UK. Have a listen.
Hi BBCOS, my name is Yinka Laniyan from Lagos, Nigeria. I heard about the new strain of the coronavirus. How potent is this new strain? Is the world in danger of second wave of coronavirus that nobody knows how to take care or know the cure or vaccine for it? Can this Pfizer vaccine, can it actually work against this new strain of coronavirus?
Right, thanks for that question. Talking about a new strain, this is something mentioned by the UK Health Secretary Matt Hancock yesterday, talking about the rising cases in the region where I'm sitting right now, the southeast of England and London. What is a new strain exactly, Dr. Isaac, a new variant? What does that actually mean?
Yeah, that's a really important question because we know that viruses, like all viruses around the world, doesn't matter if it's a coronavirus or not, all viruses mutate. They just change with time. It just means their genetic structure is changing. Some change a little faster, some change a little slower. Whenever we hear the word mutation, we automatically conjure up these terrible images like, oh no, this is going to be a worse virus, it's going to be more lethal, more easily transmitted. But in fact, most mutations don't really do much. Now, it's too soon to know what this strain actually means. Does this mutation confer any different function of the virus? Too soon to tell. Too soon to tell. What's great is that you've got the right people working on it. You've got excellent surveillance programs that have detected this. And these are all answerable questions. So I think if we also take a step back and look at the big picture, we've seen stories like this emerge several times throughout the pandemic.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not like it's been COVID-19 and now we've got a new strain. There's been loads of them.
Right. Like to date, like none of these have really panned out into anything more significant. At the end of the day, what are you going to do? Put on a mask, physically distant from other people, don't go into crowded spaces. Like, it doesn't change anything that we do at an individual level.
And it's good to hear that reassurance. I'm sure people will be enjoying hearing that and can read more as well on BBC News Online. James Gallagher, our health and science correspondent, has written a piece, the headline, New COVID Strain, How Worried Should We Be? And goes into some of the other new strains and variants that have been found. Lots of information there and links to other places where you can find out more. Of course, there's lots of interest in it. And Dr. Isaac's right, that word mutation perhaps sounds scarier than it needs to be in this case. So thanks very much indeed, Dr. Isaac Bergosh. Always great to have you on from Toronto. We'll speak to you again next week here on OS.
This is the BBC World Service. What can a body reveal about a person's life?
Deafness,
inflammatory bowel disease,
heart rhythm disturbance,
manic depressive disorder,
fevers and headaches,
liver failure,
congenital syphilis,
lead poisoning,
mercury poisoning.
Beethoven, the composer of some of the world's most recognisable pieces of music.
Just the thought that someone in his state could write anything.
When he died in 1827, his autopsy revealed he was suffering from numerous ailments.
You look at the score closely, it starts off with heavy of heart, but that could also be sensation of squeezing of the chest, a chest tightness.
I'm Georgia Mann. I'm exploring how Beethoven's illnesses translated into his work.
As a result of the deafness, the things have to be larger than life.
How his physical and mental health became a part of his music.
Dissecting Beethoven. Sunday at 14 GMT.
You're with the BBC, Ben James with you for this edition of OS. In a few minutes, we'll hear a conversation from South Korea on coronavirus. It's seen as one of the global success stories so far, but cases have now risen to record levels. They are still low in global terms, but we'll find out how Koreans feel about the new restrictions they're facing. That conversation coming up, plus analysis from BBC Korean after these headlines.
BBC News with Debbie Russ. The World Health Organization has warned of a big shortfall in funding for its plans to ensure that coronavirus vaccines and treatments are available to all countries. A senior official said this was hindering efforts to find a way out of the pandemic as soon as possible. The European Commission President has welcomed a decision by EU regulators to bring forward a meeting on whether to approve a coronavirus vaccine. In a tweet, Ursula von der Leyen said every day counts. The European Medicines Agency has come under pressure to speed up the approval process. The Republican Majority Leader in the US Senate, Mitch McConnell, has acknowledged that Joe Biden won last month's presidential election. He congratulated Mr. Biden the day after his victory over Donald Trump was officially confirmed by the Electoral College. The European Union has announced draft laws to regulate how big technology firms such as Google and Amazon operate within the bloc. Companies that break the proposed rules could be fined up to 10% of their European turnover. The EU says the aim is to bring order to chaos. The campaign group Human Rights Watch says the Saudi authorities